lots of times in life, and this is something really worth knowing, and this is one of the advantages to being an autonomous adult, is you don't get to pick the best thing. You get to pick your poison. You have 2 bad choices, and you get to pick which one you're willing to suffer through. And every choice has a bit of that element in it. And so if you know that, it's really freeing, because otherwise you torture yourself by thinking, well, maybe there's a good solution to this, compared to the bad solution. It's like, no, sometimes there's just risky solution 1 and risky solution 2. And sometimes both of them are really bad, but you at least get to pick which one you're willing to suffer through. And that actually makes quite a bit of difference, because you're also facing it voluntarily then, instead of it chasing you. And that is an entirely different psychophysiological response. Challenge versus threat, it's not the same, even if the magnitude of the problem is the same. And so putting yourself in a challenging, let's call it mind frame, you can't just do that by magic. Putting yourself in a challenging mind frame is much easier on you psychophysiologically, because you don't go into the generalized stress response to the same degree. And you're activating your exploratory and seeking systems, which are dopaminergically mediated and that involve positive emotion. So if you can face something voluntarily rather than having it chase you, it's way better for you psychophysiologically. So that's partly why, well, it's worthwhile to go find the dragon in its lair instead of waiting for it to come and eat you. So, and especially when you also add the idea that if you go find the dragon in its lair, you might find it when it's a baby instead of a full-fledged bloody monster that is definitely going to take you down. And so that's part of the reason why, well, there's a whole bunch of things that emerge out of that observation, like don't avoid small problems that you know are there. Face them, because they'll grow into big problems all by themselves. And you can think about, imagine the tax department sends you a notification. You owe them like $300. Well, that's annoying. Maybe you don't even want to open the letter. Or maybe if you do, you just put it on the shelf. But that damn thing doesn't just sit there like a piece of paper on the shelf, right? You ignore that for 5 or 6 years, it's going to become attached to all sorts of horrible things. And if you ignore it long enough, you get the idea. It's going to turn into something that is completely unlike the little piece of paper that it's written on. And many problems in life are like that. You'll see that they pop their ugly little head up, and and you might want to turn away. You might not want to think about it, which is the easiest way of turning away, right? You just don't attend to it. It's not like you repress it or anything like that. You just fail to attend to it. And that's as a long-term strategy, it's dismal. It's also something I think that's more characteristic of people who are high in neuroticism and high in agreeableness, because agreeable people don't like conflict. And people who are high in neuroticism, who are high in negative emotion, are hit harder per unit of uncertainty or threat. And so, and that's partly why in psychotherapy, a lot of times the people you see need assertiveness training, so that would be the opposite of agreeableness, or they need to help get their anxiety and emotional pain under control. Those are not the only reasons. There's antisocial behavior, but you can't fix that in therapy in all likelihood. There's alcoholism. There's lots of other reasons, but those are 2 major reasons. You set out a goal for yourself in your life. It's like a stage in your life, you might say that. And then when you run that goal to its end, when that stage comes to an end, then you have to regroup and orient yourself once again. And I was making the case that that's a good time to make necessary sacrifices, and part of that's because as you move through your life, you have to shed that which is no longer necessary, and because otherwise it accretes around you and holds you down and you perish sooner than you should. And I think that's in large part because if you don't dispense with your life as you move through it, then the stress of all that undone business and all those unmade decisions turns into a kind of chaos around you. And that chaos puts you in a state of psychophysiological emergency preparedness chronically, and that just ages you. And so it's necessary in some sense to stay light on your feet, and also, I think, to renew your commitment to your aim upward. And I believe that that's what the sacrificial routines in the Abrahamic stories dramatize. I said already that these things are often first portrayed very dramatically and concretely before they become psychologized. And we'll see, because one of the things that happens tonight as well in these stories is that when God makes his covenant with Abraham, this is the next part of the story, it's also when the idea of circumcision is introduced into ancient Hebrew culture. Now, there's every bit of evidence that other cultures were utilizing circumcision beforehand, so it wasn't necessarily a novel invention of the Abrahamic people, but I see its introduction as a step on the road to the psychologization of the idea of sacrifice, right? First of all, it's giving up something concrete, and then second, it's signified by the sacrifice of a part of the body instead of for the sake of the whole. It's something like that. It's dramatizing the idea that you have to give up a part of yourself for the sake of the whole. And eventually, well, by modern times, that becomes virtually completely psychological in its essence, in that we all understand, perhaps not as well as we should, but at least well enough to explain it, that it's necessary to make sacrifices to move ahead in life. One of the themes that I'd like to explore tonight in relationship, especially to the sacrifice of Isaac, is that, once humanity had established the idea that sacrifice was necessary to move ahead, which is really, it's a discovery of incalculable magnitude, right? The idea that you can give up something in the present and that will, in some sense, ensure a better future is an unbelievable achievement. It's equivalent to the discovery of the future. It's equivalent to the discovery of the utility of work. Like, its importance can't be overstated. Okay, so it took a long time for people to figure this out. Animals haven't figured it out at all, right? We've figured it out, and it's hard. It's hard for people to make sacrifices because, of course, the present has a major grip on you, as it should, because in some way you live in the present. So anyways, there's the twin problem of getting the whole idea of sacrifice up and running and then figuring out exactly what it means. But there's a problem that branches off that too, or a twofold problem. So the hypothesis is that sacrifice is necessary to ensure that the future is safe and secure and productive and positive and all of those things. Okay, so then two questions immediately rise from that, right? One is, well, what's the proper sacrifice? Now, we already talked about that a little bit with regards to Cain and Abel, and one of the things we saw was that Cain's sacrifice, whatever it was wrong, and Abel's was right. Noah's seemed to be right. Abraham seems to be right. There is something about a sacrifice that can be correct. There's something about a sacrifice that can be incorrect. The question is, what would be the maximally correct sacrifice? So, because that's an obvious question to arise from the mere observation that sacrifice is necessary. Okay, if you're going to sacrifice and it's necessary, well, how is it that you would behave if you were going to do it really well, if you're going to do it perfectly? Okay, so that's question number one. And then question number two might be, well, if the future can be better because of a sacrifice, and sacrifices can vary in quality, then how much better could the future be if your sacrifice was of the highest quality, right? There's a limit issue there, and the limit is something like, well, how good could your life be? If you really got your act together and you gave up all the things that were impeding you in your movement forward, if you did that forthrightly and with integrity and with seriousness, with dead seriousness, and you tried to set your life right, what is the upper limits with regards to how your life might lay itself out? And I would say, well, we don't know the answer to that, but I think that the idea of something like the city of God or the kingdom of God on earth or the reestablishment of paradise, something like that, is the answer of the imagination to the question, how good could the future be if sacrifice was optimized? And those are archetypal questions, right? And an archetypal question is a question that everyone asks, whether they know it or not, because sometimes you can act out a question. An archetypal question is a question that everyone asks, and an archetypal answer is the answer that can't be made any better to that question. I called the course Personality and Its Transformations, and I think you could think about that as a restatement of the idea of being and becoming. And that's what you are. You're, for whatever that means, you're an entity that both is and is transforming. And there's a rule that goes along with that, by the way, which is don't sacrifice who you could be for who you are, which means if you have to choose to transform in a positive direction or maintain your current position, then it's better to transform in a positive direction. So you might even think of that as the core of your being. That's a Piagetian idea. It's a Jungian idea as well. Who are you? You're the thing that transforms who you are. Now, you're also who you are, but on top of that, you're the thing that transforms who you are. And I do think that that's not an arbitrary statement. One of the things that modern universities do dreadfully now is convince their students that value structures are relative, and that's a big mistake. There's a lot of things wrong with that idea, and one of the things that's wrong with that idea is that doesn't include what I just mentioned, which is that's a good moral rule, is you are the thing that is and you're the thing that becomes, and you should put the thing that becomes at a higher place than the thing that is. That means you also have to allow yourself to shake off those things about you that you might be pathologically attached to, habits and people, for that matter, ways of thinking, all of those things. You have to allow yourself to shake those off, and that's more like a burning. That's why the phoenix is the symbol that it is, right? It's old and it deteriorates, it bursts into flame, and then it's reborn. It's like, well, do you want to be reborn? It's like, well, that's not the question. The question is, do you want to burst into flame? And the answer to that generally is no, but that's the wrong answer. The right answer is you let all that nonsense burn away. And you might say, well, I don't know what I should leave behind. And the answer to that is that's a lie. You know some of the things that you should leave behind. All you have to do is ask yourself. You'll come up with a list instantly of 100 stupid things that you're doing that you know you could stop doing. Some of them maybe you don't know you could stop doing. It's like, well, fine, leave those alone for now. But there's a bunch of things you perfectly know well that you could stop doing that would improve your life. And so do that, see what happens. That's a good idea. All right. So it's personality and its transformations, because partly I wanted to talk to you about what you are as a human being and also as an individual, but also what you could become. And that's actually a crucial question in the domains of clinical psychology in particular, because a lot of what you're doing with people as a clinician is trying to figure out who they could become. That's right. You have a problem, your life isn't what it could be. It's like, fine, let's see what it could be like if we changed it. We'll figure out how to change it. That's got to be a negotiated dialogue, right? Because I don't know what the hell you should do with your life. I can help you figure it out, maybe. We can talk about it, but you are the person who has to decide if the things that you're aiming for, get you out of bed in the morning, because that's at least one of the crucial issues. So you got to specify the goal. And then you got to specify the transformation processes and start practicing them. And you have to understand that you're going to be bad at it, but it doesn't matter, because bad's fine. Persistent is what you need to be. If you persist, with tiny improvements, if you persist, you win. So, okay, so in a broader context, you can think about this as a more fundamental ontological question. So one question is how you should act in the world. The other question is, well, what is the world? And that's a complicated problem. This is a scientific answer to that question, and that is that the world is a collection of objective phenomena. And that's a very powerful perspective. And we have a good method for determining what the world is like as a collection of objective phenomena. And that's made us very technologically powerful. And so more power to us and all that, but leaves a question unanswered. And the question is, well, the world isn't just a place of objective phenomena, because it's not a panoply of inert matter. It has living, conscious creatures in it, and they're a different order of being. And the fundamental issue for conscious, active creatures is not what is the world from an objective perspective, but how it is that you should conduct yourself in the world. And there's a kind of unbridgeable gap between those two domains of inquiry. And I think the reason for that is that the scientific method removes value from its descriptions. That's actually what it does. And so once you're left with value-free descriptions, it's very difficult to extract out a value proposition from them, because that's the scientific method removes the value propositions. You're supposed to be left with only that which is objective, right? And value propositions are in the domain of the subjective. So I think the idea that you can derive what you should be or do from a collection of facts is flawed, A, because the collecting the facts themselves gets rid of the value structure, but B, there's an infinite number of facts, and so how are you going to pick which ones should guide you? You can't. you can't. You have to do something else. The facts do not tell you what to do with the facts. You need something else to help you figure that out. Well, it's come to me over the years that that's what the narrative cognitive framework does. It's the framework that we use to specify how we should act in the world. And so you could divide the world into the world as it is and the world as perhaps it should be. That gives you some direction, and you need that, and we know this technically, right? You need direction. The reason for that is it's direction that produces primary positive emotion. And so if you need positive emotion to move through life, which you do, because you can't even move without positive emotion, and also positive emotion is a good bulwark against terror and pain. If you need those things, then you need direction, you need a goal, you need a value structure. So that doesn't seem particularly disputable to me. You could still say, well, what value structure? It's like, okay, fine, that's a good question. But I've thought a lot about that too. So if we're going to adopt a value structure, there's a couple of rules that go along with it. And this is why the bloody postmodernists are wrong, as far as I can tell, is A, it can't just be my value structure, because I'm stuck with you. And we're both stuck with all these other people. And so if I'm going to lay out a value structure, which is a way of interpreting the world, let's say, and there's an infinite number of potential ways of interpreting the world, it's like, yeah, fine, no problem, except that I have to interpret the world in a way that I can use while I'm dealing with you, and while the two of us are dealing with everyone else, and while all of you are dealing with everyone else. And so that's the Piagetian game proposition. If you want to be a popular kid on the playground, you better play games that other people want to play. That's a brilliant observation. And I told you that Piaget was trying to heal the rift between science and religion, and that's one of the things that he did that he thought helped do that. The question is, well, where do moral judgments come from? Well, they emerge as a consequence of consensus, and it's a bounded domain. If we're going to occupy the same space for any length of time, and those are two critical propositions, the same space and a long time, then we have to figure out how to play an iterative game that doesn't spiral downward, hopefully that might even improve, that we both don't object to, because otherwise it's not going to work, right? You'll walk away and play another game, or the game will disintegrate catastrophically. So there's massive social constraint on what constitutes an appropriate frame of reference. So much for the relativist argument. And then there's another issue that's equally relevant, and it's associated with the idea of objective reality to some degree. But that's not exactly correct, because it's not exactly objective reality. Let's say that you and I decide to occupy the same place for some substantial amount of time, and we figured out how to solve the problem of being together. But you and I still have to figure out how to solve the problem of being together in a manner that doesn't make the world object too much. And it isn't just other people, although that's a huge part of the world. You want them to not object. You may even want them to support you. That would even be better. But you also have to deal with the tendency of matter to object. Because so your mode of being in the world, your interpretive framework, as a description of how you should act, is actually the laying out of a strategy that will produce the ends that it predicts, which are the things that you want. So this is the pragmatist perspective. This was worked out by William James and his people back in the late 1800s in New England, the only genuine brand of American philosophy. And what the pragmatist said is, how do you decide if something's true? The answer is, how the hell can you? You don't know anything. Well, that's true, but that isn't helpful, because there you're stuck with the problem of how to be in the world. Well, so what you do is you lay out a mode of interpretation that has an endpoint. And then you run the mode of interpretation, embodied, right, because you act it out. And if it doesn't produce the outcome, then it's not, well, let's say, true. The claims within it they're not true by the definition of the game itself. So you might say, well, you're a kid on a playground. You want to play a game. One of the implicit demands is that the game is fun. If it's not fun, it's not worth playing. So you play it for a while, and then you see, well, was that fun? If the answer is yes, then you keep playing the game. You say, well, that game it's good enough, it's accurate enough, it's true enough. And so you lay out interpretations in the world, and they're subject to massive constraints. Other people have to go along with them and cooperate with you, because if they don't, then look the hell out, like it's a major, serious, non-trivial constraint. And then the other thing is, well, social proof isn't good enough. It also has to work in the world outside of the social world. So if you have an illness and you have some hypothesis about how to construe it, you might say, well, is my understanding of the illness correct? Well, it implies that I take these actions. Well, how do you know if it's correct? Well, you take the actions, and if the illness gets worse, then by the definitions that are implicit in the framework of reference that you're using, you've made an error. And so there's no relativism in that. You could still say, well, there's a lot of potential solutions to any potential set of problems. It's like, yeah, there's lots of different ways to play chess on a single board. Right, but that doesn't mean that any old solution is as good as any other solution. It doesn't mean that at all. So, okay, so then we're looking at things two ways. We're trying to figure out, well, how does the world present itself, and then how is it that you should act in it? And so...
Is it a blessing or a curse to feel everything so deeply?
It's both, I think. It's a blessing and a curse. So I suppose the benefit it delivers is an expanded scope of experience. And it's possible as well that if it was done well, it would be better than anything. But if it isn't done well, it's very, very punishing. So I think you can make that case about self-consciousness in people. I mean, self-consciousness as a trait loads on neuroticism. So, and when people say, I became self-conscious, they usually mean they've become embarrassed or anxious, right? And those things do overlap to a tremendous degree. So self-consciousness per se, as an experienced phenomenon, is associated with negative emotion. Well, but do you want to dispense with it? Well, no, because it's really informative, but you don't want to experience it. So if you're made self-conscious by one of your inadequacies, you want to remove the inadequacy. You don't want to remove the self-consciousness. But it can get out of hand too. People can be so self-conscious and so self-critical that they can't move forward. So it can definitely be, you can have too much of that, that's for sure. And it's one of the things you do as a behavior therapist, again, a cognitive behavior therapist, is if you have someone who's particularly self-conscious, there'll be a litany in their head of all of their inadequacies. And so it's like they have an inner tormentor that just constantly natters at them about how useless and weak and inadequate they are. And there's a lot of stock arguments that repeat. And one of the things you do with someone who is in that situation is you have them write down all their self-critical thoughts, and you do that dialectically. You help them over many sessions make a complete account, and then you help them develop counter-arguments. Not false counter-arguments, but you go after it. It's like, well, is that really true? And here's the evidence that it's not. And so you can bolster people against the consequences of self-consciousness gone amok. And that's often quite effective.
It's difficult, though. Where does that voice tend to come from?
Well, it's probably, at least in part, the inevitable consequence of being a creature who's continually being socially evaluated. So you have a voice inside that's something like the abstracted average of everyone's criticism of everyone. And that's useful because it reminds you not to do things that other people are going to object to. It also, assuming your culture is reasonably functional, it also reminds you not to do things that are going to be counterproductive. And so that's one source. It's like interiorized public opinion. And then other sources are, well, it's also the voice of your ideals. And that in that sense, you might consider it your conscience. And that can be, well, that's extraordinarily useful because it points out your shortcomings. Now, one of the things I've analyzed the movie Pinocchio sort of ad nauseum, I would say, but it's been very useful to me. One of the things that's so remarkable about that movie is that the voice of the conscience, which is portrayed by Jiminy Cricket, is symbolically associated with Jesus Christ in the movie. And but interestingly enough, there's a dialectical relationship between the puppet, the wooden-headed puppet whose strings are being pulled by external forces, and the conscience. So despite the voice of the conscience being symbolically associated with Christ, the conscience has something to learn during the journey as well. And so there's like a dialogue between the conscience and the developing individual, and the consequence of the dialogue is the conscience gets more effective as the person becomes more developed. And I think that's right, because imagine that you have the average ideal inside you speaking to you, and you have the average social voice inside you speaking to you, but it isn't really speaking to you. It isn't taking your particularities into account. And it isn't until you engage with your conscience that you can craft it into something that's actually speaking specifically to you. And then that's much less burdensome and much more effective. And so, and I think that's reasonable, because I don't think the conscience starts out infallible.